The cameras were already flashing before the hearing even began, but when Judge Ruth Bader leaned forward and cut across Jasmine Crockett's words, the room shifted into something else entirely. A hush rolled through the chamber, and for a heartbeat it felt as though the very air had gone still. "That's irrelevant," Ruth snapped, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. Every journalist in the front row jolted forward, pens pressed to paper, lenses snapping faster, capturing the confrontation in real time. The judge's dismissal wasn't just procedural. It was personal, dripping with the kind of authority that dared Crockett to retreat. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she let the silence breathe, let it stretch out long enough for everyone in the chamber to feel the weight of what had just been said. Somewhere in the gallery, a spectator gasped, and the sound ricocheted off the marble walls like a gunshot. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side sat Ruth Bader, senior, polished, cloaked in the tradition of power, her expression carved into a scowl of superiority. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, young, unshaken, her presence radiating the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Every eye in the room darted between them, as though waiting for the inevitable collision. Reporters whispered to one another. Did Ruth just shut her down? Will Crockett fold? The tension grew unbearable, thick enough that even the microphones seemed to buzz with it. And then, in the heavy pause that followed, Jasmine tilted her chin upward. No words yet, just a gesture, subtle but commanding, as if to say, "You will not erase me." Not today. It was enough to spark a ripple in the audience. Heads turned. A wave of murmurs passed like static through the chamber. Somewhere in the corner, a young intern leaned to his colleague and whispered, "She's about to fire back, isn't she?" But Jasmine still held her tongue. She let the silence hang, pulling everyone further into the suspense. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She was writing the stage directions of her own drama, and Ruth had walked right into it. And that's when it became clear something unforgettable was about to unfold. Because no one in that room, not even Ruth herself, was prepared for Jasmine's next words, the tension did not fade with Ruth Bader's interruption. It deepened. This wasn't just a clash between two figures inside a courtroom. It was the collision of two Americas. On one side, Ruth embodied the old guard, entrenched, dismissive, and armed with the weight of establishment power. On the other, Jasmine Crockett represented something far larger than herself. The voice of communities who had fought too long to be dismissed, silenced, or told that their struggles were irrelevant. Journalists in the press box already knew the headlines would write themselves. Judge Bader strikes at Rising Star. Crockett on the defensive. But beneath the surface, something more consequential was unfolding. Because in that silence Jasmine held, there was defiance. And defiance has a way of shifting the ground beneath the mighty. The stakes stretched far beyond a single exchange of words. Crockett wasn't simply defending a statement. She was defending the right of her constituents, and by extension, countless marginalized voices, to exist in the national conversation without being shut down by arrogance masked as authority. Every immigrant watching at home, every young student told they don't belong, every worker who had been ignored in boardrooms or sidelined in offices could see themselves in Jasmine at that moment, and they waited, breathless, for her answer. But Ruth believed she had cornered her opponent. To her, Jasmine was inexperienced, too young, too raw to withstand the weight of courtroom pressure. Ruth's challenge, "That's irrelevant," wasn't just about dismissing one point. It was about dismissing the person behind it. With those two words, she tried to erase years of lived experience, to shrink Jasmine into silence. Yet the power dynamics were shifting in ways Ruth could not feel. Every camera angle captured her scowl, her impatience, her certainty that dominance would prevail. But dominance only works if the other side bows. Jasmine didn't bow. She sat, silent and unflinching, and the silence itself became an indictment. The audience leaned forward. What began as a routine clash now felt like history in the making. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the room, pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. Each second of Jasmine's silence stretched into something larger, something symbolic. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore. It was a moral test. And that was the danger Ruth never anticipated. By attempting to silence Jasmine, she had elevated her. Every word Jasmine was about to speak carried 10 times the weight it would have had moments before. The audience knew it. The reporters knew it. Even Ruth's own clerks exchanged nervous glances, sensing that their judge had overplayed her hand. The clash had grown from an interruption into a trial of values. Arrogance versus dignity. Authority versus truth. And just as the chamber began to exhale, just as people thought the silence might drag on forever, Jasmine finally leaned into her microphone. Her lips parted, and the anticipation felt unbearable. This was no longer about one woman answering a judge. It was about whether dignity could survive in the face of dismissal. It was about whether voices long pushed to the margins could finally command the center of the room. And as Jasmine drew in her breath, the audience braced itself. Because whatever she said next wasn't going to be routine, it was going to be history. What came out of her mouth in the next instant would change the entire trajectory of the hearing, and, as some would later argue, even the national conversation itself. To understand why Ruth Bader's words struck with such sharpness, one must understand the story she carried into that room. For decades, Ruth had been the embodiment of institutional power, seasoned, commanding, and untouchable. Her voice had echoed in courtrooms across the nation, and her reputation was built on an aura of invincibility. When she spoke, the assumption was that others would fall silent. Yet behind the polished robe and the measured tone lay patterns that critics had begun to notice. Ruth was not simply a protector of the law. She was also a guardian of the establishment, fiercely resistant to new voices she believed lacked the discipline of her generation. Her rulings, her statements, even her offhand remarks carried a subtle undertone. The belief that those who challenged the order she cherished were reckless, unprepared, or unworthy. This wasn't the first time Ruth had wielded her authority to diminish someone younger, bolder, or different. Reporters remembered past hearings where she'd cut off women of color mid-sentence, her interruptions framed as necessary, but leaving an unmistakable sting. To her allies, this was strength. To her critics, it was arrogance. And arrogance is a dangerous mask because it convinces the wearer that they cannot be questioned. Ruth had grown accustomed to winning every exchange before it began, her sheer presence enough to keep challengers at bay. But times were changing, and the very confidence that once secured her dominance was beginning to reveal cracks. Her attack on Jasmine wasn't simply professional, it was personal. Ruth saw in Jasmine something she did not expect: youthful energy fused with conviction, a refusal to be tamed by hierarchy. It reminded her, perhaps uncomfortably, of her own early days when she too had battled to be heard in male-dominated halls. But instead of recognizing the parallel, Ruth turned that discomfort into dismissal. And in that choice lay the seeds of her undoing. Because in dismissing Jasmine, Ruth wasn't just clashing with an opponent. She was clashing with an entire generation, an entire movement of voices that would no longer accept being called irrelevant. Every camera in the courtroom recorded her scowl, her clipped tone, her certainty that she had struck the final blow. But outside those walls, in homes and offices across the country, viewers saw something different. They saw a judge who no longer represented courage, but condescension. They saw authority tipping into overreach. They saw the face of an establishment struggling to contain the tide of change. And deep down, though she would never admit it, Ruth knew the danger of that perception. For once, she wasn't the symbol of strength. She was the symbol of resistance to progress. The irony was sharp. The very power she had built her legacy upon now threatened to become the force that unraveled it. And as the silence in the courtroom stretched on, it was clear Ruth had underestimated her opponent. She had miscalculated the moment, and that mistake was about to cost her far more than she realized. Long before Jasmine Crockett walked into that courtroom, long before her name trended across social media, her story was being written in quieter, harder places. She did not inherit power. She did not inherit influence. What she carried with her were scars. Scars earned in neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce, and voices like hers were often ignored. She had learned early what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers who doubted her ability, colleagues who dismissed her, doors that were closed before she even reached the handle. Each slight could have been an anchor, pulling her deeper into silence. But Jasmine refused the role of the voiceless. Every dismissal became fuel. Every obstacle became proof that resilience, not privilege, would define her path. Her journey through law school was less about prestige and more about survival. While others had networks to lean on, Jasmine built hers from scratch. Mentors who saw her grit, classmates who eventually learned to respect her precision in argument. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but when she spoke, people noticed. There was a rhythm to her words, sharpened by the lived experience of someone who had been silenced too many times to waste a single sentence. Public service became her battlefield. She chose cases no one else wanted. Families on the brink of eviction, workers cheated out of wages, immigrants told they didn't belong. Each victory wasn't just legal, it was personal. To Jasmine, defending dignity was not a strategy, it was her identity. She understood what it meant to have dignity stripped away, and she vowed never to let anyone endure that unchallenged. It was this history, this resilience, that she carried into the confrontation with Ruth Bader. And while Ruth wielded the weight of decades in office, Jasmine wielded something more dangerous: authenticity. She wasn't speaking to impress the chamber. She was speaking to honor every person who had been cut off mid-sentence, dismissed as irrelevant, or told to wait their turn. Her composure in the courtroom was not in spite of her journey. It was because of it. She had faced dismissals far colder than Ruth's. She had endured interruptions sharper than any gavel. And every time, she had risen with more resolve. This was why the silence after Ruth's attack didn't weaken Jasmine. It strengthened her. She understood the power of waiting, of letting the room absorb the insult before delivering the truth. It was the patience of someone who had fought battles measured not in minutes, but in years. The cameras may have seen a poised congresswoman sitting quietly, but beneath that stillness was a lifetime of fire. The daughter who refused to let her family be written out of the American story. The student who turned rejection into resilience. The lawyer who fought for clients nobody else would take. Now, as she sat across from Ruth Bader, that fire sharpened into clarity. She was not just representing herself. She was representing every immigrant worker who had been told their labor was invisible, every woman of color who had been talked over in boardrooms, every young activist who had been told they were too naive to lead. Ruth thought she was silencing Jasmine, but what Ruth had really done was summon all of those voices into the chamber. They stood invisibly behind Jasmine now, filling the silence, amplifying the moment. And it was this invisible chorus that gave Jasmine her strength. Because she knew the words she was about to speak were not hers alone. They belonged to everyone who had ever been told, "That's irrelevant." She would answer not as a lone figure, but as the embodiment of a larger struggle. And in doing so, she was about to turn Ruth's attack into a turning point that no one would forget. The silence had stretched long enough. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering, waiting for the clash to break wide open. And then Ruth, perhaps unsettled by Jasmine's refusal to retreat, struck again. "Answer the question directly," she demanded, her tone sharp, clip designed to cut. Jasmine's gaze lifted, steady and unwavering. "I will," she said calmly, "but only if the question is relevant to the truth we're all here to uncover." It was not loud, but it landed with force. The chamber stirred. Some in the audience smirked, others gasped. Ruth's eyes narrowed. She was used to control, used to obedience. Instead, she was met with defiance delivered in the quietest of tones. The duel had begun. Ruth leaned back in her chair, her robe falling into sharp folds, a picture of authority trying to reassert itself. "You are wasting this committee's time with theatrics," she shot back. Jasmine didn't flinch. "What wastes time," she replied, "is dismissing the experiences of the very people this institution claims to serve." The room erupted in whispers. Phones buzzed as aides sent hurried texts to their offices. It's happening. Crockett is standing her ground. Ruth, visibly irritated, cut in again. That's not your place to decide. But Jasmine was ready. It's every representative's place, she said firmly, to decide when truth is being buried beneath procedure. The tension thickened, a back and forth that felt less like a hearing and more like a duel staged for history. Each of Ruth's interruptions grew sharper, angrier. Each of Jasmine's replies grew calmer, stronger, layered with dignity. The contrast was undeniable. One rattled, the other composed. Reporters scribbled faster, already drafting leads for tomorrow's papers. Bader loses her cool. Crockett refuses to bow. The audience in the gallery could feel it too. The balance of power was shifting. Still, Ruth pressed harder. You are grandstanding, Miss Crockett. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her voice even but piercing. If defending my constituents against being silenced is grandstanding, then I'll stand as tall as it takes. A murmur swept across the chamber like a wave. Ruth's lips tightened, her authority cracking in real time. She opened her mouth to respond, but the impact of Jasmine's words lingered too heavily in the air, drowning out anything else. The escalation had reached its peak. The interruptions, the tension, the visible unraveling of Ruth's composure. It was all building toward a moment no one could stop. And as Jasmine gathered her notes, pausing for the first time to truly look her opponent in the eye, the silence returned. It wasn't the silence of retreat. It was the silence before thunder. The room braced itself, because Jasmine was about to deliver the counterattack that would leave everyone frozen in their seats. The silence before Jasmine spoke stretched into something electric, something that made even the most seasoned reporters forget to blink. Ruth's last words still hung in the air like a threat, but Jasmine's reply would turn that threat into rubble. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice low at first, almost conversational. You say I'm wasting time, she began, but let me remind you whose time this truly belongs to. It belongs to the people who sent me here, and those people are tired of being dismissed. A ripple of movement shot through the audience. The journalist shifted, pens scratching furiously. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, steady, but brimming with a kind of moral fire that no gavel could extinguish. Ruth tried to interject, but Jasmine's voice rose just enough to cover the attempt without ever breaking its composure. For generations, people like mine have been told to wait. To wait for recognition, to wait for fairness, to wait for dignity. And now, when I refuse to wait, you call it irrelevant. The chamber stirred again, louder this time. Even some of Ruth's aides looked down at their papers, unable to meet the gaze of a woman speaking truth with such precision. Jasmine continued, her cadence deliberate, each word landing like a carefully aimed strike. This committee was not built to protect the powerful from accountability. It was built to give a voice to those who cannot sit in these chairs themselves. So if my words feel inconvenient, maybe it is not my relevance in question, but yours. Gasps. Audible, sharp, undeniable. Ruth's expression flickered, just for a second, but in that flicker, the entire chamber saw it. Doubt. Jasmine pressed forward. You want me silent, because silence has always served power. But I did not come here to serve power. I came here to serve people. People whose lives are dismissed the same way you just dismissed my statement. The audience leaned in, the energy rising with each sentence. Reporters knew they had just witnessed the moment the hearing flipped on its head. Ruth was no longer in control. And still, Jasmine wasn't done. She softened her tone, the sharp edges giving way to something heavier, almost haunting. When you told me that's irrelevant, you didn't just insult me. You insulted every worker who earns too little to be heard. Every immigrant told their story doesn't matter. Every woman interrupted in rooms like this. And if you think I will let that pass without a reply, then you have gravely underestimated me. A pause, long enough for the meaning to sink in, long enough for the room to hold its collective breath. Then she delivered the final blow, each word carved into history. Irrelevant? No. What's irrelevant is clinging to authority that refuses to face the truth. What's irrelevant is silencing those who dare to speak it. And what's most irrelevant of all is the belief that fear can still control this room. Because today it doesn't. The audience erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few cheers that quickly fell under the judge's glare. Cameras flashed like lightning, immortalizing the moment Ruth Bader's authority cracked in real time. Jasmine sat back, her face calm, almost serene, as if she hadn't just dismantled decades of intimidation with a few sentences. But everyone else in the chamber knew what had just happened. Ruth had attacked, and Jasmine had answered, not with volume, not with anger, but with the kind of truth that freezes a room in its tracks. For a few stunned seconds, Ruth didn't move. The gavel in her hand felt heavy, almost useless. And the silence that followed was no longer hers to command. It belonged to Jasmine Crockett. And beyond those walls, the shockwaves were already spreading. Social media notifications pinged, journalists whispered, history recorded itself in real time. Because what Jasmine had just done was more than a counterattack. It was a declaration, and the country was about to feel its impact. The chamber had barely absorbed Jasmine Crockett's final words before the shockwaves began. Phones buzzed in the audience, screens lighting up as reporters scrambled to push breaking alerts. Crockett stuns Bader. Irrelevant backfires. The story was out before Ruth could even raise her gavel. But the ripple didn't stop inside those walls. Within minutes, the moment exploded online. A short clip of Jasmine's mic drop reply. 30 seconds of clarity, defiance, and dignity spread like wildfire across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags emerged instantly. Hashtag relevant voices, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag frozen room. Each replay carried the same captioned words. Irrelevant? No. What's irrelevant is silencing the truth. The public response was visceral. Thousands of comments poured in. This is what courage looks like. Finally, someone said it out loud. I felt seen when she spoke those words. The voices Jasmine had invoked, workers, immigrants, women silenced in boardrooms, now filled the digital landscape with gratitude and pride. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. By evening, clips of Jasmine's reply ran side by side with audience laughter at Ruth's scowl, comedians joking that the judge had been roasted without a flame. But the humor was layered with something deeper, a collective recognition that a line had been crossed, and Jasmine had drawn it back with authority. Cable networks shifted their programming to replay the exchange, analysts dissecting each word. Conservative pundits called it grandstanding. Progressive commentators hailed it as a defining moment of truth-telling. But regardless of spin, everyone agreed on one thing. The balance of power in that room had flipped, and the world had watched it happen. Even celebrities joined in. An award-winning actress tweeted, Jasmine Crockett just reminded us all what relevance really means. A Grammy-winning artist posted the clip on Instagram with the caption, Mic dropped. Dignity wins. For Ruth Bader, the aftermath was less kind. Editorials questioned whether her tone had revealed a deeper bias, whether her dismissal of Jasmine's words symbolized a broader dismissal of the communities Jasmine represented. Headlines asked, is Bader out of touch? Even those who once defended her authority hesitated, unwilling to attach themselves to a moment replayed millions of times with a narrative of arrogance. In contrast, Jasmine's star rose. Commentators describe her not just as a politician, but as a voice for a generation demanding respect. Social media users swapped her quotes like rallying cries, posting them beside photos of protests, classrooms, and workplaces. It was no longer just about one courtroom clash. It was about identity, belonging, and a refusal to be silenced. And yet, as the reaction swelled, one truth became undeniable. What Jasmine had unleashed could not be contained by hashtags or headlines. It was bigger than the moment. It was bigger than the chamber. It was a reminder that dignity, once spoken into the world with courage, cannot be erased. The shockwaves kept building, rolling outward, leaving the country waiting for the next step, the next word, the next lesson. Because everyone knew the fight wasn't finished yet. As the dust settled from the uproar, one truth echoed louder than any headline. Jasmine Crockett had not just defended herself. She had defended millions who had felt dismissed, diminished, or silenced. The moment that froze the room was no longer about a single confrontation. It had become a mirror, reflecting the larger struggle between dignity and arrogance, between those who seek to silence and those who dare to speak. Jasmine herself captured it best in her closing remarks. Her voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the noise. "We must decide," she said, "whether we want to live in a country where power decides who matters, or a country where every voice counts." Today was never just about me. It was about us, about all of us who refused to be erased. The audience sat in rapt silence, the weight of her words carrying more than legal argument. They carried moral clarity. The clash that began with Ruth's sharp dismissal ended with Jasmine's reminder that relevance is not dictated by status or authority. It is earned through truth, service, and courage. That message resonated far beyond the chamber. Students replayed her speech in classrooms, teachers using it as an example of standing tall in the face of condescension. Activists held up her quotes at rallies, chanting her words as slogans. Even parents shared the clip with their children, framing it as a lesson in courage and self-worth. And here was the moral heartbeat of the story. When dignity confronts arrogance, dignity endures. When truth collides with dismissal, truth survives. Jasmine's courage reminded the nation that relevance is not granted by those in power. It is claimed by those who refuse to be silenced. For Ruth, the confrontation may have ended in a frozen silence. But for Jasmine, it marked the beginning of something larger, a movement of people emboldened to speak their truth. The clash had become a catalyst. As the video replayed across millions of screens, the outro wrote itself, not in scripted words, but in lived reactions. Hashtags weren't just trends, they were communities forming. Memes weren't just jokes, they were shields of solidarity. And every person who whispered, "She spoke for me," became part of the story. And that is why this moment matters. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she lit a fire. A fire that will burn in committee rooms, classrooms, workplaces, and kitchens across America. So to you, watching now, this story isn't only hers. It belongs to you too. Share it. Remember it. Carry it into your own battles, big or small. Let it remind you that relevance isn't handed down, it is claimed. Because when arrogance tries to silence dignity, dignity will always rise. And when truth speaks, the world cannot help but listen. That was Jasmine Crockett's gift. And now, it's yours to carry forward.